Information Technology Leaders is sponsored by Pemco Corporation, a technology holding company that delivers IT services to a broad range of customers. Pemco Technology Services provides Visa and MasterCard processing for more than 230 credit unions and banks. Pemco Corporation Computer Services delivers customized IT outsourcing to meet the needs of small and mid-sized companies. This week on Information Technology Leaders, Jack Brown, Chief Operating Officer of Pemco Corporation. Now here's your host, Laura Schildkraut.
Today's guest is the Chief Operating Officer of the Pemco Corporation. His career began as a data processing operator working the night shift at Security Pacific Bank to fund his college education. He continued on at the bank before joining the Air Force. After 4 years in the military, he returned to Security Pacific, where his career enjoyed a steep trajectory towards a VP role. After several other senior-level positions with large and small companies and 2 failed attempts at retirement, he is now accountable for defining and leading profitable growth for Pemco. The term multitasking appears to describe him best, but still doesn't seem to do him justice. Throughout his career, he has invariably been not only involved in his job, but also in pursuing further education, tinkering with cars through the ownership of a racing team and automotive performance engineering company, and giving back to his community, generally concurrently. His philosophy is to leverage everything. With so much going on, there's always tremendous leverage opportunity. Please welcome Jack Brown. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Southern California.
Yeah.
In the post-World War II era.
How old were you when you rebuilt your first car?
9.
Yeah. What made that appealing to you?
It got me out of the house and into the garage.
The garage was a good place to be?
In my house, yeah.
It was? What were you like in high school?
I think in high school I was curious about a lot of things. I enjoyed most of the courses I took. I started working full-time fairly early, so I was working in high school too. So I was a bit of a grind, perhaps, in that aspect.
Tell us about the Los Angeles Art Center, and in which artistic area did you specialize?
When I was in high school, I was fortunate to be in the advanced program, and I actually got a scholarship to LA Art Center. And at that time, I was very interested in photography. So I was able to study photography there, and then I worked for about 7 years as a photographer.
How did you decide which college to attend?
Mostly I knew where I didn't want to go.
Which was?
I had scholarships to Caltech, MIT, and USC.
And you still didn't think you were smart?
I knew I didn't want to go there.
Okay.
So I chose a smaller college in Los Angeles.
Why didn't the larger schools appeal to you?
I had an opportunity to go there before attending school and looking at the size of the classes and how disassociated, at least in my perspective, you were from the learning process until you were well into it. Was the biggest turnoff for me.
And what area was your primary focus?
First pass through college, my primary focus was electronic engineering.
Did you work during college?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Where did you work?
I worked in 2 areas. As I mentioned, I worked as a photographer for a number of years, and that took me into my college years. And I started working with Security Pacific Bank on the second and third shifts at nighttime, and then going to school during the day.
How did you get discovered out of the mailroom, or did you sort of push for doing something else?
I actually got fired out of the mailroom.
Did you? Yeah, they let you stay and do something else?
Yeah, they let me stay, yeah. So apparently I had some qualities that made sense at that point in time. So.
Can I ask how you got fired out of the mailroom?
Sure.
I can ask.
There was a fellow that ran the whole operation, and he was an ex-Marine, very, very strict on his approach to life. And he came in one night in the middle of the night, and I was breaking down statements and putting them in distribution. And I had a cup of coffee, and he just went berserk. He said, "You'll spill that coffee on the statements." And I said, no, it's over here. And after about 3 iterations of him explaining that I would spill the coffee on the statements, I said, you're right. So I poured it on the statements.
That was it?
That was pretty much it. So
Yeah.
I figured I'd just go on home, which I did, but they called 2 days later and said, you know, why aren't you at work?
we want to promote you.
Yeah. So.
How did you manage to get your schoolwork done while you were working at night?
Pretty much about, I would say 12 to 15 years of never sleeping helped.
Yeah.
Having no personal life and things like that all flows in.
Well, you stayed at Security Pacific Bank after graduation. Did you pursue other opportunities, or did that one just sort of happen gracefully?
It happened somewhat gracefully. As I was finishing up my education in engineering, Security Pacific was undertaking a shift in their whole technology base. It was 1964 was the evolution of the IBM 360, and they were moving from their previous generation of computers. And so actually initially my hardware engineering was used to build some of the technology to bridge the data transportation from one generation to the next.
And how did your title and job responsibilities shift as you became sort of more full-time?
It shifted initially into the technical side. I was more in the lead analyst and programming side, and then I began to lead some of the teams that were doing the work. So I moved from the engineering aspect of it to leading teams of engineers.
Did you feel that you were prepared to lead people? Was that a kind of a natural thing or something that you had to stumble through?
I would say stumble through would be a good way to define it. My first job in leadership was actually in the operational side, and I was leading one of the night shifts doing check processing. And it was a great learning experience. Had a very homogeneous workforce. I was the only man in the building, and all the women were on my team, and 100% of them were divorced. So I was 23 years old. I thought I was in heaven. But, you can't do that anymore.
No,
they really
no.
frown on that.
I won't ask whether or not
Yeah.
you were in heaven. I'm just going to let that go. So after about a year of working with Security Pacific, kind of as a full-time employee, you started to look in another direction. How did that come about?
While I was working with Security Pacific, we were undergoing changes in technology. Part of the change in direction really in that time frame was the evolution of the Vietnam War. I had been in a class that wasn't being drafted for some period of time. The rules changed, and so I was looking to see, from a military perspective, anticipating that I would be drafted. I was looking to see what opportunities were there.
Yeah. Well, you said that you were very opposed to the Vietnam War, yet you sort of started to look at going. What made you shift your perspective?
I believed at the time, that you really could change the system from the inside out. I think with age and maturity, you know, revolution's looking better than evolution, but at that point in time, it made sense to me.
How did your driving record impact your options and your opportunities?
Well, I started, as I mentioned earlier, with cars, and I had raced cars for a long time. I had accrued a significant number of driving offenses, which actually got me in a class with the draft board, along with other well-known criminals, and in the words of Arlo Guthrie, the father rapers and everybody else. However, that changed. That led to being drafted. That led to, okay, let's understand the options.
And what did you do while you were awaiting your security clearance?
In the Air Force, it took quite a while to get the security clearance. I had an opportunity to work with the Air Force rifle team and international competition, and also as a weapons instructor prior to getting the clearance.
How had you learned so much about guns?
Rough neighborhood. Basically.
Seriously?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I grew up in Barrio in Southern California. We didn't have the fancy ordinance, but you learned the basics.
Yeah.
So.
You then moved into the NSA, the National Security Agency. Why was that area such a good fit for you?
I think it was a couple things. It grew along three things I was interested in, which was the technology aspect of things, the engineering, raw technology, the engineering, and how it was coming together with the teams. At that point in time, from the national security aspect, NSA aspect, we were looking at airborne intelligence collection systems. That was kind of cool technology stuff. We were looking at significant challenges of putting all the intelligence together. And then lastly, we were building engineering teams that could do that. So it was intriguing.
After 4 years on active duty, had you found that you could change things from the inside?
Not really.
No?
No. It did change me, but I found I didn't.
How did it change you?
I think it took my perspective to a more mature perspective. It was a standard process of growing up to some degree. There's an idealism aspect of it, and then there's a practical aspect of it, and I think it helped me get a better grip on that, get a balance of those.
You still maintain your top security clearance. Why is that so important to you?
It's not a, well, it's important in the context that long ago I signed contracts that have me still available for service. At some point that will stop, either at a certain age and or by death, but therefore I have to keep my security clearances active.
You said that you spent a good deal of time during your last year thinking about what you wanted to do after that. What did you decide?
I really wanted to stay in the technology aspect of things, but I wanted to also be in a leadership aspect and working with people. I enjoyed the technology aspect. I found people much more challenging.
Truly. You'd gotten a position with Computer Science Corp. How did things go on your first day of work?
It was a very short job. While I was still on active duty, I interviewed and took a job with computer science. I showed up in El Segundo for my first day of work into a building that had nothing but empty desks. And I finally found the person who had hired me, and he said, "I forgot to call and tell you we lost the contract." So, really sorry about that.
So you now have no job.
Pretty much.
What did that experience teach you about not burning bridges and the importance of maintaining connections?
Well, I had maintained connections with Security Pacific, and I had been discussing with them returning. And I had also, at the same time, shared with them what I was looking at and where my interests were. So I went back and we talked about it, and I returned.
Now, it could have been sort of an awkward situation because they had been interested in your returning to them and you made a decision to go with another company. What are some of the things that you did to make it okay for you to call them and say, "Guess what, guys? I'd like to take you up on that offer," after saying no thank you? Well,
I had built, I think, very good relationships in Security Pacific, and I also kept people informed. I'm looking at several things. These are the type of things that I'm interested in. Not that I wouldn't come work for you, but this is a slightly better opportunity. When that evaporated, those connections, the network work was still there. It really is the importance of building and maintaining networks, I think, is really the lesson there.
And I think dealing with them candidly as well, that they knew what was going on.
Right.
And the bank was also going through another upgrade. Why were you such a good candidate to lead this project?
They were shifting technology platforms again. They were going through a basic re-engineering of what they were doing. That's what I had worked in the first cycle with Security Pacific. It's what I had been working on essentially, fundamentally, while I was on active duty. So from that aspect, I think it was a good fit.
Had the bank changed a lot since you were with them originally?
They had grown, and the number of businesses they were getting into was expanding quite a bit. The opportunity to support those businesses with technology had moved over about a 5-year period, so there's a lot of opportunity there.
Did that growth affect the way that you managed the project?
The fundamentals were pretty much the same, I would say. The nature of managing multiple projects versus single projects really kicked in that era. So you really had a portfolio of projects because you had to disassemble the overall challenge into piece parts, operate it from that aspect.
Well, then in 1976, the bank started to focus on electronic transactions. Why was this so critical for the bank, and how did it create opportunities for you?
A couple things. I think particularly from the consumer banking aspect, there was an ongoing belief that the paper checks would in fact decrease in volume and over time be replaced by electronics. Now that ongoing belief was in place for probably 20 plus years, and every year check processing grew about 7 to 8%.
And expensive.
And very expensive. So there was a business pressure there. I think from the electronic side of things, the opportunities for me, it's a new era to explore. They had undertaken a small foray into electronic banking in a separate company. The separate company was just hemorrhaging money like crazy. They looked around and said, would anybody like this dying company even if you screw it up, we won't fire you, because it's already pretty much underwater already. So that sounded cool. So I signed up for
You
that.
like that idea.
Yeah.
And what was your role with that?
Several things from the technology aspect, but really had to reevaluate the technologies in use. We had to basically increase the capability of the business to handle transactions. At the same time, we had to do all the basic business 101 stuff to get costs under control, to get effective marketing in place, to get effective repeatable operations in place. All those kind of things were challenges.
Now, I believe that when this came on, you got a fairly significant promotion during this. Did your peers and your staff sort of welcome you in that new elevated role?
Peers, no. Staff, yes. Both myself and one other person kind of jumped over 3 layers in the hierarchy of the organization, and it created a lot of ill will. Over time, that went away. And it's all about performance at the end of the day. But
what are some of the characteristics that you think you exhibited that made you so promotion worthy? I mean, that's a fairly big leap.
Part of me says I don't really know. But as I think about it, I think keeping a perspective of always understanding the big picture and stepping back from what you're working on to see how it fits, stepping back to see what it takes to make your boss successful is kind of important. And I've always focused on that as much as possible. And, you know, in the old Woody Allen, timing is everything. It's being there at the right time.
Right. And what are some of the things that you did to sort of smooth over things with your peers?
Well, both myself and this other person tried to incorporate them into our processes, learn from them, form a team with them versus go off and do it ourselves. And I think over time that added a lot of value.
You were also going to school at the time. What degree were you pursuing?
In 1977, I went back to pursue an undergraduate degree in computer science. And then after that, I went into the master's program in computer science. And then about the same time I was in the master's program in computer science, the bank came back and said, you know, we have this great opportunity for you to go to business school, and particularly UCLA Graduate School of Management has this executive development program. And I couldn't pass that up, so I was doing, concurrently I was doing the master's work in computer science and also the business work.
Yeah, because clearly one of them wouldn't have been enough, because you could have easily dropped back on the master's and still done the UCLA thing, but not going to happen.
What fun would that be?
Yeah. How, when you were working full-time and going to school, how did you find that your work impacted your schoolwork and your schoolwork impacted your work? Not just in terms of time management, but in terms of what you brought to each?
I think it brought experience into the school environment that perhaps some of the other students hadn't had the opportunity to gain. And particularly in some of the work that I did at work, particularly some of the technical work, was fairly leading edge at the time, and by simply lifting that work, scrubbing the company name off of it, it became my master's thesis in my computer science program. And strangely enough, I didn't have to do a lot of work in that one.
So leverage.
Lots of leverage.
Lots of leverage. In 1980, the automation area became a separate company. What was your role in this new company?
Initially, my role was one of, for several years, was running the electronic banking side of the new company. The bank essentially picked up the technology and operational unit and put it in the marketplace as a standalone company, said, go forth and prosper and have a good day, etc. And then goodbye. So my role initially was building the electronic banking side of that business.
What was easier as a separate company and what was harder as a separate company?
Easier as a separate company was gaining flexibility and approval. Particularly in Security Pacific, a large part of the culture was a lot of different businesses in competition with each other. And when you sat in the technology chair, you were in the middle of all of that. So to get people to agree to something took a tremendous amount of uplift and effort, a lot of negotiation. As a separate company, you had more flexibility. Also, as a separate company, on the harder side was you suddenly had no flow of income either. You basically were put into a venture capital mode. And so you had to learn that aspect and grow that way.
Did you realize that part of it going in?
Didn't really have an option. Showed up one Monday and said, "You're a separate company. Go forth and prosper."
Yeah.
Somebody planned it out, we think, although we never found that person. But net, that's really what happened.
It sounds like the culture of the organization had to change. How long did it take to change, and how long should it have taken?
It took about 18 months, I think, for the organization to recognize they were a business. And that was 18 months of solid communication, teaching, creating a Bible of how you run it as a separate business, tremendous amount of effort. The real recognition of that in the people believing it and operating of that, it really took about 3+ years. I'm not too sure you could do it faster and be successful.
Yeah, it's hard to shift that. It almost would be easier to start with new people, but that's not necessarily an effective way to do it. Tell us about the customer information file and why that project was so important.
That was a project in that time frame. One of the reasons it was important from a business perspective for Security Pacific Bank, which we were engineering the solution for, was they wanted to move from a very transaction-oriented business to a relationship-oriented business. They really wanted to have a perspective of their customers and their customers' relationships. Their systems did not provide that at that point in time. There was a great debate because of the size of their business. Could you ever build a system that would do that? We partnered with a small unknown computer company called IBM, which was coming out with a small unknown basically data system called DB2, and said, we think if we go off in a corner and put a little skunk works together, we can build a solution that will scale to that size and will give the bank what they want. So we did it on an R&D basis, basically on spec. We then took it back, presented it to the bank. The vice chairman that ran that segment of the bank fell in love with it, and the rest was go do it. So
was the go do it part easier or harder than you expected it to be?
Actually, it wasn't that difficult because we'd done a lot of the pre-work in the prototype, the R&D stage.
It's hard to get kind of the consistency to get all the systems together.
Yeah, this one took 35 different transaction-oriented processing systems and crunched it all down, and then basically presented a vision of the customer. And that vision then we integrated with, at that point in time, the teller support system. So when you walked up to the teller, they could see your total relationship, and they could have a dialogue with you that was much different than give me your check and I'll give you your money.
Right. And did you have another account?
Yeah.
Oh. So you'd mentioned that you were also participating in this UCLA program. What was so special about this program that it made you want to do it?
The neat thing about the program was two-phased. It was a 2-year program. The first year was a very compressed MBA, kind of like the Father Guido Sarducci 5-minute university. They kind of crunched the MBA into that first year. And the second year was, okay, now that's all good stuff, but forget all that. Now how do you apply it? In the particular time frame, this was when Japanese management was going to rule the world and all those kinds of things. So the second year was focused on management techniques, in particular in this case. Things I worked on were both in Japan and Korea, to understand how management approaches and techniques were actually being put in place and being used in the real world. So.
You described this as both a high and a low point in your life. Why was that?
Well, between the concurrent work of, earning a paycheck, doing my master's work in computer science and doing the business work, I woke up one day and noticed I was living alone in an empty house. I literally didn't notice that until I looked around and said, oh, look, those people aren't here yet anymore. So from that aspect, that was the low aspect. Learning, balance life and personal life and work. But some of us learn the hard way.
After 8 years with Security Pacific Automation Company, you were promoted to first vice president, and you were reporting directly to the company's president. How did your role change, and did you like being that close to the sun?
Oh yeah, he was a great guy. He still is one of my best friends. The nature of Security Pacific Automation was one of business maturity, and at that era, they were basically creating new companies and getting into new areas. And I very much enjoyed that. That was a large part of what I did. And also deploying newer technologies and things of that nature. So the company was growing. There was an opportunity to drive essentially the new business side of it.
Yeah. What are some of the challenges in starting a new business?
I think it's varied over time. in that particular era, a lot of the challenges were, particularly with an established company, was moving the culture to think like a startup.
Right.
For instance, we created a standalone networking company that was basically a local call away from 95% of the population of America. And we tried to do that internally. And it took us several months to realize we weren't going to move the culture that fast. We had to go get a partner. Now, unfortunately, we got a partner, MCI, which in that time frame was fine. I think they're currently mostly indicted now, but we really had to get the culture moving fast enough to go to the startup mode.
To kind of catch up. In 1991, Bank of America acquired Security Pacific. What were your thoughts as you watched the acquisition unfold?
It was interesting to watch it from the aspect of being acquired. For about the previous 10, 12 years, one of my responsibilities had been mergers and acquisitions on the technology side, and banks in that era did a lot of acquisition. Security Pacific did probably at least one a year in the time frame I was working on it. So it was much different to see it from the other side. It's a great political dance. You put a bunch of wonderful words around it, but at the end of the day, a fish of a slightly larger size eats the smaller fish, and you just have to understand that and work from that aspect.
But you're not just looking at it as an observer, you were actually a key participant in this. Did you feel that the merger was a good idea, or you didn't even look at it that way?
Security Pacific had reached a point where there was only two options: dissolution of the company and a merger. So I thought the merger was a good idea from that aspect. Having done mergers and understanding, at least from the perspective of doing the acquiring, what was important, I think, positioned several of us to understand what we anticipated would be important to Bank of America. So how did we add value to them? How did you get past the emotionalism of, we've been here 120 years and now we're not here anymore? Answer, yes. Now how do we move forward?
Right.
So.
And what was your role during the merger?
I had a couple roles. One was to, I stayed under contract for 2 years, and one was to put the technology pieces together to work with the two organizations. And that was actually the first time I was in this area, was in that era. Security Pacific had previously acquired Rainier Bank, and then we had to put it back together also with Bank of America. So we went through the integration of the technology platforms. We also had the opportunity to bring new technologies into the Bank of America environment. So.
Well, after the merger was completed, did you want to stay with the company, or did you want to do something different?
I was looking to do something different at that point in time. At that point in my career, as well as now, I think the culture of the organization was the most important aspect to me. And as I saw the cultures change during the merger of Security Pacific, and then a return to what was essentially the previous culture of the acquiring organization, I felt it was time to look for some new opportunities.
So after only 3 years with Bank of America, you were ready to leave. What did you do?
Well, I tried retirement. That didn't work.
So why didn't retirement work?
A couple aspects. One was I couldn't find a place to live that I enjoyed. Tried Paris. I had a home in Central California. Didn't care for the food in Paris. Yeah, I know. I'm just one of 3 people on the planet.
Yeah.
And from the perspective of the small town, didn't fit me. I really missed the energy of the people. I missed the energy of the business, that type of thing. It gave me a great opportunity to expand my racing team.
Tell us about your racing team.
Never-ending pit for money, particularly in that era. But it was a good opportunity. I had time to actually get involved in it, and I have a partner that we've done it for years and could really focus on it. And at that point in time, I had the financial capability to build the team.
To keep funding it.
To keep funding it, yeah. I got about $500,000 into it, and my girlfriend at the time said, I sure hope you have a terminal disease, because you don't have the ongoing funding to keep pouring money into this thing.
So after about 6 months of retirement, what did you do?
From that aspect, I moved. I had worked with Visa for a number of years as a technical advisor, and we'd actually started a couple bank card processing companies that worked with Visa. and the person that actually had been the president of Security Pacific Automation that I worked for himself had moved to Visa. So he asked me if I would come to Visa and work there. So that was my next stop.
As it started to become real, were you excited to be back in the workforce, or were you a little...
Oh no, I was very excited to be back in the
about
workforce.
So what was one of your key projects as you started working for Visa?
The first phase of working for Visa, they were in a planning stage of looking at their next generation of infrastructure. They were pretty much the largest net consumer of certain types of technology, predominantly mainframe technology at that point in time. And that's how they ran their business. They had huge switching engines, that 3 of them are scattered around the planet, that drove their business. But they knew over time that that wouldn't carry them forward. So we spent about a year looking at alternatives to how we were going to build new platforms and move forward.
So then after about a year, you moved over to the distributed processing area. Why the move?
Well, the first phase was lay the plans, and then after the plans were laid, it was, hey, these are great, now go do it. And that was the now go do it stage of it. It was really bringing in additional technologies into the organization. It was continuing to enhance the mainframe infrastructure, but also expand a very wide range of networking infrastructure, just what that in that era, those distributed processing platforms, a lot of Unix. We put in some of the largest Unix platforms in the world at that point in time. So that was the technology aspect of it. From the business aspect, at least in that era, Visa had a very aggressive research and development approach to creating new products. And they would typically spin up 100 new ideas a year, and we would actually take those ideas through the engineering and prototyping and building of the potential product. So that was kind of interesting. About 2 to 3% of those actually turned into something. And so we had some great successes in that dimension too.
So is that the bluebird of opportunity approach?
Right. I always call it, from a business perspective, my viewpoint was that Visa had incredible amounts of money, more money than they should have. Now that subsequently changed. But the approach they used was what I call the bluebirds of opportunity. You start 100 things, and a couple of them are bound to pay off. You know, I wish I could gamble in Las Vegas that way.
Right.
Don't have that option.
Why do you think that it can be sometimes effective to let people struggle a little bit before you give them the tool they need to do a task?
Aside from just being a sadist,
it's kind of fun to watch. Yeah,
it's great fun to watch. I think what occurs is people get more closely associated with the problem and think through it more effectively. And it's a challenge for me, because I know in working with folks, you know, I do have a vision of where I'd like to be. I just don't write it all out in steps, because I think it changes as you go. But you know, typically what I've found is if you get people on the same page, they pretty much sort it out. And the end product is a lot better than just saying, you know, here's an answer, now go do it.
I think there's also something about struggling that makes them ready. So you might have a new solution, but if they haven't been struggling through the old one, they may be a little reluctant to accept it. But once there's been some sweat involved, it suddenly comes along and they're ready to make the changes.
Yeah.
That can be pretty helpful. Why was the centralization project such a huge undertaking?
In
Visa.
In Visa? Well, there are a couple of projects that were around centralization. Probably the predominant one was a technical centralization of the desktops on a worldwide basis. And that was a very challenging project, not from the technology aspect, but from the political aspect of getting, Visa at the time was 6 geographic regions and a central organization. So there were 7 dimensions of the company. Each dimension had their own board of directors, and there was no oversight to those boards of directors. So each answered only to themselves. When I first got there, they were running the company on telexes. If I wanted to send information to somebody in London, I sent them a telex. Email had been discovered, but there were a lot of barriers as to, well, you know, we like ours and you don't like yours, and we don't want to integrate. So it was a great learning experience for many of us. I had some international experience in previous jobs, but this was really an opportunity to learn even more detail in working with a bunch of folks. And it took us about 18 months to get agreement on that, and a couple cycles around the planet.
To actually do it.
To actually do it, yeah.
I would imagine that your experience doing all the mergers probably helped because you knew about the way people dig in and how difficult it can be.
Right.
What were some of the things that you did to make that successful, to kind of overcome some of the people issues, since the technology issues were not that complicated?
Right, the technology issues were not that complicated. We did develop some prototypes of how the system could work on everyone's desktop. But the real challenge was digging down and trying to find, to the degree we could, the hard benefits that people could experience, and then some of the softer benefits. And actually, a lot of them came out of the product side when we finally got through it, is that the product groups were so disassociated, and the needs of the regions were very different. The culture and economies in Southeast Asia weren't worrying about certain things that you'd worry about in New York. But those problems had been solved in New York long ago, but nobody talked. So by showing that capability, we eventually were able to sell the basis of what we were trying to do.
And then in 1999, the Visa management decided that it needed a whole new suite of systems in order to move the company forward. How did you feel about that challenge?
I felt about that challenge, it was time to go look for something else. What I just described on the desktop now had to be done with the underlying processing systems. Desktops, 18 months to agree and a year plus to do it. Fundamental processing systems, I did not believe they would ever be able to do it from a central perspective. And so, you know, it was an intellectually challenging project, but to me one that probably wouldn't lead to success, and in reality it didn't.
They never did?
They didn't do it from a central perspective. They actually restructured the organization, some other factors, disintermediation factors set in, and they no longer have the money to do that.
Yeah, and other things happened. It was no longer an option.
Right.
So you try retirement again. What made you think it would be different this time around?
I'm a very slow learner.
Apparently.
Yeah, I really am. But it was pretty much a repeat of the same kind of situation.
What did you do during this retirement?
I tried to stay away from racing.
How'd that work out for you?
Kind of okay. But this was the era of the internet. And I was intrigued by the concept of what was happening in that aspect. So that really led me to the next job.
And where was that?
I was with a company here in Seattle. Company, actually its original name was EC Direct, Electronic Commerce Direct. Changed its name to Vitessa. And they were not necessarily a startup. They'd been in place for several years. And they had a kind of a fundamental fun technology aspect to a product, but they wanted to move and become a e-commerce enabler, if you will, an e-commerce portal for others, the Amazon.com for the everyman type of environment. So that was very intriguing.
Well, you'd spent your whole career basically working in very large corporations, and now you're working in a much smaller, much newer company. What of your skills did they really need from you, and what of your skills and background did you kind of need to leave behind in order to be effective in that environment?
What they were looking for was someone that had built organizations. It wasn't an inbred capability in the team that was there at the time. So that was part of my background. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. What you have to step aside from in those kind of environments is you have to rethink how things are done. You have to do them very, very quickly. And you have to live in a tolerance for error, because it's like creating a project. If time is the most important thing, you have to give else in other dimensions.
Right.
And in that era, you know, where it may take a company a year to put a process in that kind of environment, you have 2 weeks, and you live with the results.
Did you like the startup environment?
Oh yeah, it was very energetic. I enjoyed it.
How did you deal with the board of directors, and in retrospect, how should you have dealt with them?
The board in most internet companies was pretty much made up of venture capitalists. So I had worked with boards certainly in the past, and boards all have their own motivators and that type of thing. The venture capital oriented board, if you can remember the word greed, everything else falls into place. If you try to treat them like a board, at least from my perspective, it doesn't work all that well. So that was certainly a learning from my perspective. I think one of the failings was not to step up soon enough to say, you know, I think we're growing a little fast here. we're way out ahead of the market in terms of capacity, and we're sucking up dollars at a very high rate.
Yeah. And what eventually happened to the company?
They ran out of money, basically.
You said that you were introduced to Pemco by accident. What happened?
Literally.
Literally, huh?
At that time, actually, I had my resume on the internet. It was on Monster. Someone at Pemco had seen my resume, and they had called me about a position. About a week after I got that call, somebody ran into me who happened to be insured by Pemco. And so I wound up going to a Pemco claim center, and the service was incredible. People were very attentive. I had already done my research and knew exactly what was broken, and they said, no, he's got a bunch of other stuff that's broken here. So I was very, very impressed. They called back a little later. I thought it was the insurance people calling again. It was actually the HR folks, and they wanted to talk.
Yeah.
So,
how many interviews did you go through before accepting the position?
19.
19. Who initiated all those interviews?
Probably about 80% of those were at my request. I got a sense of what the company was. I got a sense of what they wanted to do, but I didn't have a good sense of the customer base for the organization. Pemco is an alliance of multiple companies, and Pemco Corporation has 3 of those entities within it. So they have customers that they serve, and I wanted to understand where they were, what the customer perspective was, what the internal organization felt. I did say I was a slow learner, but I do learn, and I really wanted to be comfortable that I understood it.
So it sounds like you weren't really reluctant with aspects of the job. You just felt you wanted to understand the company better before you said yes. You were pretty sure you were going to say yes at that point? Or?
Pretty sure. The culture and environment at Pemco is very unique. All of the companies very much operate on relationship-based models. That's true for how the companies interact with the staff. It's very values-oriented. It's all about doing the right thing. It's all about building long-term relationships and value and letting the business grow from that. That sounds academically interesting. I'd never found an organization that had actually done that. So it took me a while to actually internalize and say, yeah, I guess that's really what they're doing here, and it's working.
So it's almost like you'd found a lot of companies that talk the talk, but...
It's usually on the wall in a plaque someplace, but that's about where it stops.
What is the scope of the Chief Operating Officer job, and why was this such a good fit for you?
A couple things going on in the organization. One, Pemco Corporation really has 3 entities within it. One entity is a bank card services company. It's been established, been in place for about 10 years, growing quite effectively, typically in a 20, 23, 24% compound growth per year. They have challenges in scaling, really addressing a broader demand for their services. There's a computer service organization which had served predominantly as an internal group, kind of like a DP department for multiple folks, but had not operated as a standalone business. And so that was challenging. I felt that would be an interesting challenge. And the third piece of the organization is a life insurance company, of which I know nothing, and pretty much still do. But it was an opportunity to learn that aspect of the business.
We talked about some of the differences between a large and a small organization. What are some of the differences and similarities between a publicly held company and a private company?
Well, there's some very obvious ones about who do you answer to and how quickly. In public companies, it's all about the quarter. And it's all about how are we doing in the quarter. In privately held companies in the venture capital side, it's all about how are we doing this month, and when do we get my money back, and when do I get filthy rich. In the context of the environment such as Pemco, where you have various degrees of ownership, you have multiple types of ownership. Insurance companies and mutuals owned by the policy holders. The credit union is owned by the members. Pemco Corporation is a privately held stock. We do answer to shareholders, but we have more flexibility.
Right.
We move in ways that make sense, and we see business growth as a natural byproduct of fundamental business models.
Tell us about the aggressive transition that Pemco's IT organization is undergoing.
They're really, particularly in the computer services company, we have gone through a tremendous amount of change. And we have focused in a couple areas. One is the underlying service capabilities and operational capabilities. We have adopted the ITIL model. public domain infrastructure best practices. And we've really gotten to a position where in many cases we are on an industry leading curve of how we're building those processes in. So that's improving the capability of the organization to deliver. Concurrently, we really had to look at the financial performance of the organization. Just looking at the financial performance of the organization, it had consistently been underwater, which was okay for some period of time because it wasn't operating as a standalone business. Right. But as a standalone business, it really had to reach a financial performance perspective that said it was self-sustaining, and even beyond that could generate the capital to grow. And that was the other aspect of it. And both pieces are well underway. Both are demonstrating very good results.
Yeah. Sounds like it's right up your alley. Anyway.
It had a certain familiar ring to it.
Yeah. How would you describe your management style?
I guess a couple of aspects. I think it's important to essentially get teams together that are made up of folks that can work and respect each other to move forward, get a general sense of where we want to go. And I view my job as much as possible looking further down the road to try to get the big rocks out of the road and stay out of the way of the folks that are trying to get the day-to-day work done. Now, from a self-learning perspective, that's been hard for me over my career because I'm a tinkerer. I want to know what's going on. But I've learned to stand back and observe the results versus the working parts, and it seems to work fairly well.
Does trust come easy?
I think in groups it takes time to build, particularly if the group is under pressure. Business is changing. Are we going to survive? Do we have new product? All those kinds of things. But once it's there, it really helps the group move forward in an integrated way. I've certainly worked in companies where trust was consciously not part of the mix. The companies would create competing businesses. We want to be in this business, we're going to start 3. One of you will survive, 2 of you won't. We all understood that. We all operated to that mode.
Right.
To be long term, that's not the most effective way to do it.
You talked about the importance of putting together teams where there is a lot of respect throughout. Have you ever put together a team that didn't work, and
sure.
how did you recognize it and how did you resolve it?
My classic approach, if it got down to 2 different people, for instance, that I'm in this part of the company and I have this view, and I'm in this part and I have this view. Usually I changed their roles, sent them out of my office and said, come back.
So they exchange roles?
So they would take each other's jobs. And if that didn't work, because they feared, what's this crazy person going to do next? Frequently that worked. But if that didn't work, you really have to start changing the mix, the players. Yeah. It's not about good or bad. It's just you want to get a good working relationship.
What are some of the trigger points to you that tell you that a team isn't working together, isn't working well together?
I think you have to stay close to multiple parts of the organization. You have to understand how people are behaving. You have to build trust yourself bidirectionally that, from my perspective, I want to hear all the news. I know I'll hear the good news. I don't have to do anything to hear the good news. Right. It comes. I also want to hear the other things. One of my rules in life is I will shoot the messenger if you arrive late. So other than that, it's got to operate on a trust basis.
But if you arrive on time?
If you arrive on time, we need to know that. If you arrive ahead of time, you get extra credit.
Well, we have a pretty good idea of what successes can do for a career. What do failures or mistakes do for a career?
Assuming they're not continually repeated to the definition of insanity, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity to learn from those. It depends on the culture of the organization. Some cases, as I described, failure was guaranteed for 2 out of 3 businesses. People understood that. It became very Darwinian. Everything you could do to undercut the other people, up to and including, putting trigger wires in their homes and their cars at night, could be done.
And you knew how to do that.
Yeah, I knew how to do that. So from that aspect, it basically can be a problem. But the reality is, by bringing the teams back to a common position, I think it works much more effectively.
How do you motivate people when things get tough?
A couple aspects, I think. Frequently you have to look backwards to see forwards. And we're going through this right now in one of our companies is, let's make sure we have the rearview mirror up there too, to see all the distance we have come. Because it's all about a journey, it's not about an event, and the journey gets more difficult.
Right.
The world gets more difficult, it gets more complex, but we celebrate the successes as we go. And we do everything we can to prepare people for the future, recognizing that in the best of all worlds, they'll all make it, and the reality, some won't. And so we have to prepare for that too.
How do you personally handle stress?
Usually with humor. And actually everything else in life. But
have you ever been faced with an ethical challenge in the workplace? And if so, when you look back at how you handled it, are you feeling good about that?
Yes, I think an example would be if you compare business practices around the world, they can be very different. I've been in situations where, graft and greasing many skids was just part of how you did business in a country. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I also recognize there are different value systems, etc. Probably the most challenging ethical situation I was in was with a company that took several of us outside of the U.S. into a different company to present us with
Into a different country?
Yes, into a different country to present us with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity if only certain things happen. I didn't feel that was the right thing to do. So.
And how did you handle it?
I basically came back to the U.S. and then notified the authorities what was going on.
Yeah. Did it create a difficult working environment afterwards, or did it kind of go away?
I thought it would create a difficult working environment, but actually it did not. It was dealt with, and we moved ahead, and
everything was all right?
Everything was okay.
Well, outside of work, you have two passions, one for automotive performance and the other for business education. Tell us about those and why they're so important to you.
Well, I've tinkered with cars for a long time. I enjoy it. Growing up as an engineer, I like to work with stuff. In my role today, I work with people, not so much with the details of things. So that it's an outlet. It's a relaxation. It's a hobby going out of control. In the aspect of working with young people, the Washington Business Week program, which I've had an opportunity to join actually through Pemco, it has been great. I'm on the board of directors, I'm on the development committee, I'm on the finance committee. The Business Week program takes high school students, allows them an immersion, typically a one-week immersion, into a simulated business environment. It's not designed to turn them into business people, but to expose them to the concept of business. And the profit motive is not necessarily a bad thing, and this is why it exists. And so it has great opportunity for the students. Also, Pemco is fairly unique in that the program uses what they call company advisors, and these are typically volunteers from companies that work with the students for a week, either during the summer. These programs typically occur at various universities, and during the year they occur in school. And that's a great development opportunity for the company advisors also. So that's worked well from both aspects.
And what are some of the things that you've seen from the students that have been really satisfying?
Well, what I find, particularly when I attend the student work or the student presentations or the student seminars that they hold, is some number actually, my term, get it. They understand what's going on. They're getting excited about it. They're getting excited about seeing a different aspect of working with these clowns that they see in other classes, but hadn't necessarily thought of. Some students are just disconnected. You know, I'm here, I got to be here, check the box, let me out. But the ones that really get excited about it are very rewarding.
It's pretty wonderful, isn't it? Yeah. What are some of the things that you look for in a potential new hire?
Well, the classic things are, can do, will do, and fit. Can the person do the job? Do they have the necessary skills? Will the person do the job? What is their motivation? And try to understand that from a number of perspectives, not just, I need a job. That's a fairly common one. But the last one is really fit. And fit to me is very, very important. The example of Pemco. I went through a number of interviews because I want to understand the fit. And so in looking at bringing people into the organization, that's something I try to focus on.
Do you try to do that because you want to protect the integrity of the culture, or because people who don't share that vision don't usually succeed?
It's really both. it can be disruptive to the culture. The culture is pretty self-healing, at least the current culture I work in. Those folks stand out pretty quickly, and they typically don't stay that long.
Right.
But it's unfair to the person to say, well, you know, you probably have a different perspective, and you know, you might not fit in here, but we'll give it a go.
Right.
You know, it's probably not that fair to the individual.
Given the prevalence of outsourcing, how would you recommend that new graduates start looking for jobs, and in which areas?
Well, I think the classic perspectives is to look at those areas, particularly looking forward. What are those areas that are less regimented, and where do you typically bring multiple things together that can't be done as easily at a distance? Outsourcing works fine for many things. And in my career, I've worked with a number of outsourcing organizations, had hundreds of people offshore doing aspects of work. What hasn't worked well is to try to integrate them into the business in a way that they have to have multiple perspectives, in a way that they do things that need a lot of direct contact. Quantify the work, make it very repeatable. You're a candidate for outsourcing. It's just the bottom line.
If you were starting a career today, what type of job do you think you would seek?
That's a good question. I did go down a path. One of the reasons I went to school repeatedly was I really enjoyed teaching. And I actually took a teaching position at one time. I'd probably pursue that path.
Yeah. I'd like to close with a composite quote from some of the people that Jack works with. My first impression of Jack was that he was quiet and fatherly, but I've gotten to know him. I see him as more of a hipster than a dad. Another thing that I've learned about Jack over time is that he's always thinking well beyond where we are focused in our current planning cycle. Jack has such a clear vision for where the company has the potential to go, matched with the steadiness and determination required to lead us there. 3 specific things that he's done that have been invaluable are to develop and nurture better relationships with the Pemco Alliance companies by treating them as customers. The enormous trust that Jack has built breaks down barriers every day. Jack has also brought a strong sense of measurement to our company. This enables us to more effectively track our performance and drive our future. Finally, he has facilitated discussions of what our company should be and how we should be organized. Given his depth and diversity of the experiences, we're so lucky to have him leading this effort.
Information Technology Leaders is sponsored by Pemco Corporation, a technology holding company that delivers IT services to a broad range of customers. Pemco Technology Services provides Visa and MasterCard processing for more than 230 credit unions and banks. Pemco Corporation Computer Services delivers customized IT outsourcing to meet the needs of small and mid-sized companies.